Our next speaker is Heather Maranges. Heather is a McKnight Doctoral Fellow, has a Master of Science, and will soon have her PhD in social psychology. Her research focuses on self-control, social cognition, and morality, and their intersection. She has published scientific articles, theory papers, chapters, and encyclopedia entries, and presents her work around the nation and the world. Just in the last year, Heather has received the Outstanding Research Award from the Society of Personality and Social Psychologists, and the Leadership Award, Research and Creativity Award, and Dissertation Research Grant from Florida State University. Please join me in welcoming one of our early career speakers, Heather Maranges.
Thank you, Sam. Looking back on my prep for this, I wish I had thought about the music I listened to a little more, but you'll just have to make do. So tonight I'm going to talk to you guys about self-control and what it is. Self-control is what allows us to pursue our goals over time. It facilitates foregoing sooner, smaller rewards for larger, later rewards. Right? This is delayed discount. Basically, self-control is the ability to inhibit or override an automatic or dominant response. That could be a thought that you have, a feeling, or a behavior. And to instead act in a way that is consistent with your goals, with your values, with some standard, right? Self-control is the ability to forgo the cake and eat the apple, right? To quit drinking when you want to. It's the ability to save the money instead of spend it. And people vary in the extent to which they're able to resolve conflicts between eating the apple or the cake, right? In doing what's better for the long-term goal. This is trait self-control. And unsurprisingly, higher trait self-control is associated with better financial stability, better successes at work and in school, better health, well-being, longevity, better relationships, and less immoral, problematic, addictive, and criminal behavior. So it matters. But what may surprise you are the sorts of strategies that people who are high in trait self-control actually use. It's not the case that people high in self-control are constantly resisting problematic urges and desires. Instead, a growing body of literature suggests that people high in self-control sort of front-load this effortful deliberation or inhibition or action initiation to prevent having to deal with conflicts later on. So when it comes to the apple and the cake, they pre-commit themselves to the good choice. And they automatize or make automatic good decisions and behavior through habits. So let's take the cake example. I wish it were ice cream because of the punks and grease and all that, but imagine a person who loves cake. This isn't hard. I love cake. But who wants to eat healthy and who has high self-control. Somebody who loves cake but has a healthful goal is not going to go to the grocery store and buy a bunch of cake and bring it home and say, okay, now I'm going to resist it. No. The person high in trait self-control who wants to eat healthfully deliberates on their goal. They hold the eating healthfully goal in mind. They deliberate on how they're going to accomplish this goal of eating the apple instead of the cake, right? And then they carefully plan how they are going to avoid the cake. And they implement this plan. So over time, right, with practice, people in high trait self-control are going to make their shopping list. It doesn't include cake. They're going to walk around the dessert sections and to the apples, and they're going to do this time and time again until it is automatic or a habit. So people high in trait self-control combine these strategies to create adaptive routines so that they don't have to effortfully resist the cake. But the differences among people high and low in trait self-control run even deeper. Other research demonstrates that people high in trait self-control just don't experience problematic desires and urges to the same extent that people lower in trait self-control do. They're not as tempted to go on Facebook instead of study. They're not as tempted to snap at a rude or obnoxious coworker. They're not as tempted to have a cigarette when they're quitting. So it seems like trait self-control or self-control in general, is facilitating the integration among people's sort of feelings, thoughts, and behavior with their goals, ideals. So much of my research asks the question, do these phenomena of reduced sort of temptation and integration occur in a domain that matters a lot to us, morality? So let me pose to you guys a question that I asked my participants in a first study. Let's say you're at the grocery store or the ice cream shop, and the cashier who's distracted gives you $20 of change instead of $2 of change. Do you get his attention and give the money back? Do you keep the money and spend it on something you want? Do you keep the money and then later give it to a friend or a charity? Well, people high in trait self-control said yes, they would get his attention, no, they wouldn't keep the money. And there was also this sort of integration among thoughts and feelings. They reported that they felt really good about this decision, and they didn't feel bad that they were missing out on found money. They also reasoned or thought about this in terms of it's the right thing to do. I'm not going to do it just because I'm afraid I'm going to get in trouble, right? Or Dr. Curley's going to see me and then judge me. It was for the right reasons. And most importantly, they reported no temptation thoughts to do otherwise. So in a more rigorous test of this, I used what's called mouse tracking. And across 162 scenarios, responses to 18 different situations that vary in how extreme they are and the sorts of context in which they are, I had participants respond yes or no, whether they would do the immoral thing or the moral thing. And what mouse tracking allows me to do is to track, you guessed it, the mouse, from the bottom of the screen up to participants' responses. And we're able to measure just how conflicted people were by how close they get to the immoral response. Would you keep the money? People who get closer to this, in the direct path, are experiencing more conflict or temptation. A lot of mouse tracking research demonstrates this, but it has not been applied in this context. So I expected that participants who are high in trait self-control would get to their response relatively directly and quickly. And in contrast, the participants lower in trait self-control would say, oh, I'll give the money back, but I kind of want to keep it, okay, I'll give the money back. And indeed, this is what we found. So we know that self-control is playing a role in resolving these moral decisions when it comes to choosing between an immoral and an immoral response. The one question is, how do people higher in trait self-control resolve moral issues when more than one response could be considered moral? Okay, a true moral dilemma. So moral dilemmas entail trade-offs. Imagine you were on your way to the FSU MEDTalks, and you saw a train, and it was careening toward 5 people who, for some reason, were tied on the track. And you see that there's a lever you could pull that would switch the train to another track that would just kill one person. Do you pull the lever? Do you make the utilitarian decision to save 5 people at the cost of 1? Or do you not act? Do you avoid causing harm directly, which is consistent with deontological ethics, and not be the one to cause the harm? Well, prior research and theory suggests that deliberation is associated with the decision to pull the lever, to save the 5 at the cost of 1, whereas empathy is associated with the decision not to directly cause the harm. And as you all, very high self-control, after a long day, you're here, as you guys know, right? People high in self-control don't only deliberate, but they tend to experience high levels of empathy and consideration for other people's feelings. So we expected that people who were high in trait self-control would want to do both of these things. And if you guys want to do both of these things, you might end up looking like somebody who wants to do neither. And so in order to test our hypotheses, we use what's called process dissociation. And thanks to Dr. Paul Conway, who's actually sitting over there, we have a special set of 20 dilemmas that allow us to do this. And consistent with predictions, we found that people higher in trait self-control did want to and did tend to avoid harm more often and outcome maximize or reduce this overall suffering. And also, as expected, we found that an integration of emotional consideration for other people and pragmatic, deliberative thinking predicted these things. But remember, people high in trait self-control also strategically rely on rules and habits to get through their daily life, to do well. And we found a sort of ironic effect accordingly. The people high in trait self-control, though they tended to be higher on these things overall, experienced some conflict and ended up becoming less harm avoidant and less outcome maximizing when they depended on rules to resolve these moral dilemmas. So overall, we know that self-control really matters for moral decision making. And this comes together with a lot of research that suggests self-control is really important for moral behavior as well. So self-control really matters for morality, and we know it. Accordingly, much of my research also investigates how this obsession with self-control, because it tells us information about how moral or cooperative somebody's going to be, can bias us. In particular, across 5 studies, I examined how people use weight as a cue of self-control, and how this leads to negative moral evaluation that are based on concerns about choosing the right social partners. So I find that people judge obese individuals as less trustworthy and moral than thinner others, and this is due to self-control. I find this even when I use the exact same people before and after weight loss. So in order to test whether this evaluation transfers to behavior, I used the behavioral economic game that's very aptly named the trust game. And I find that though participants still evaluated the obese individual negatively relative to the thin other, they were willing to share resources, whether that was money or experimental credit, with their partner. So we think that they gave them the benefit of the doubt. Right? Regardless of the partner's weight, people were willing to share resources with them, probably because it's better to have a beneficial interaction than to forego one altogether. But as soon as people had the option of another partner, a thinner person, and the context more clearly was all about teamwork and cooperation, the vast majority of people chose to work with the thinner person. So in the next study, I wanted to see if I could break this effect. I wanted to get past this first impression stage and see if giving people additional countervailing information about the biological source of one's obesity would break the link between weight and assumptions about self-control. So, put another way, let's say I told you that an obese woman has a glandular disorder that causes weight gain. Would you judge her less harshly? Would you give her the benefit of the doubt in the way participants did in the trust game study? Well, the answer to this question actually depends on your self-control. Participants low in trait self-control did not include this information, did not update their impressions, and still judged the woman quite harshly. However, participants who were quite high in self-control, who we know to be quite deliberative and thoughtful, integrated this information into their moral perception formation and viewed the woman much more nicely. So this tells us a lot about how we perceive other people and how important self-control is to us. But we also know that there are other physical cues that people might be using. Right? The point is that people are looking for any hint of self-control because it matters for morality. Tattoos. People assume that tattoos are tracking others' trait self-control. And the research does indicate that on average, people who have tattoos tend to be more impulsive than not. So I again test the hypotheses that people are going to moralize tattoos because of what it says about self-control. And that's what I found. So now that you guys are very familiar with some behavioral findings that have to do self-control, and given that this is a med talk, I'm sure you're really interested in the biology of self-control. And so am I, luckily. So we know that self-control depends on the prefrontal cortex, right? This is the phylogenetically newest, most complex part of the brain. And when people are using self-control, we see activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or the DLPFC. And this part of the brain is responsible for abstract thinking and executive functions, right, which add together to allow people to use self-control. We also know that self-control depends on the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, or VMPFC, which actually requires a sagittal slice or a sagittal view. But this part of the brain receives messages from the lower brain regions, from the limbic system, right, the amygdala, and it takes gut feelings into account when people are making their decisions. And very nearby, again, that requires a sagittal view, is the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC. And the ACC plays a role in monitoring performance and catching errors, like, oh, no, don't hit the cake, right? And this also plays a role. So one of the ways by which we've learned a lot about the brain and self-control comes from research with sleep. So if you've ever been sleep deprived, and based on the high-achieving nature of this room, I'm just going to guess that you have, you know that it is really hard to use your self-control the day after you haven't slept enough or slept at all. This is why you should not stay up all night to study. Just get some sleep. Sorry, I see my students in here. So when you are sleep deprived, what happens is there's a decoupling of the frontal cortex with the lower brain, right? Such that the VMPFC kind of loses control of the limbic system. And there's actually increased activation in the reward center. Your brain wants the cake even more, and you're having a tougher time controlling that desire. So I was interested in clues from the link between sleep and self-control. I find that for couples, spouses who have not gotten as much sleep as they're used to getting are less satisfied with their relationships the next day. And in fact, all of those little things that get to you from day to day really get to you when you haven't slept. And so we think that it takes self-control to give your partner the benefit of the doubt, right? To reason with yourself when they don't unroll their socks to put them in the hamper, that it's not the end of the world. Okay? So what does this tell us about the neurochemistry or genetic underpinnings of self-control, which are not well understood? I'm going to say a lot, or hope a lot. So my work focuses on the biology of sleep and self-control. Specifically, sleep is really important because when you're sleeping, an enzyme called adenosine deaminase breaks down adenosine. Adenosine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter that basically makes you sleepy. For all of you pre-med in here, and I know there are a lot, you probably learned that ATP is the cellular energy source. It's used in cellular respiration. And a byproduct of the phosphate bond breaks when ATP is being used is adenosine. So basically your cells have been doing a lot, they should really settle down and rest. Caffeine, sweet, sweet caffeine, works not by giving you more energy, but by blocking adenosine from telling your cells that you're sleepy and that you should sleep. Your sensitivity to adenosine depends on the distribution of receptors in your central nervous system. And when you wake up feeling rested, it's only because that enzyme has cleared it sufficiently. So I'm interested in whether these factors, or variation in the metabolism of adenosine, or sensitivity to adenosine, are contributing to individual differences in trait self-control. So in a first and very, very obvious demonstration, I found that participants who were quite low in trait self-control, or who had a lot of daily demands on their self-control, regardless of their trait self-control, that these people depended on caffeine to bolster their self-control. They strategically consumed caffeine to improve their self-control when it came to regulating their mood, interacting with other people, and their performance at work. Accordingly, people who were lower in trait self-control or higher in their daily demands consumed way larger and way more numerous caffeinated drinks throughout the day. They're more caffeine dependent, and they report much more intense withdrawal symptoms. So obviously there are ways to get at these factors more directly. And I am currently studying genes that are associated with the adenosine deaminase enzyme and with the A2A adenosine receptors. And I hope that by the next time I give a med talk, I'll be able to talk about those findings a little more. So thank you all.